Bring her in here. Ryman turned as they approached. Elora helped Tara over the step, then followed this complete stranger down a short hall and into a cramped room tucked behind the stairwell. A bed with a rustic wooden frame and patchwork quilt stood against the wall, and Tara sighed with relief as Elora helped her onto it. Sleep. And Tara sighed with relief as Elora helped her onto it. Sleep. The mattress squeaked as Elora pulled the quilt over her sister, then unlaced Tara's boots and tugged them from her feet. The mattress squeaked as Elora pulled the quilt over her sister. She then unlaced Tara's boots and tugged... Oh my gosh. She then unlaced Tara's boots and tugged them from her feet. Elora turned to find the steward watching them from the hall. Thank you. Her lip trembled as the emotions of the morning caught up to her. They'd made it here. Their father hadn't caught up to them yet. Tara was safe. The steward nodded for her to follow him back into the others. As Ryman sat on his wooden rocking chair, the atmosphere inside his home seemed opposite that of Tam's the night before. Light poured through the front. Green plants sat on every open surface. Rugs and colorful tapestries warmed the space, offsetting the cool stone. Ryman slid his hands along the smooth wooden arms of his chair, then tilted back and set it in motion. The wood creaked as he rocked back and forth. I don't believe you tromped down here from Cassillon to find a place for your friend to rest. So please, enlighten me as to why you showed up on my doorstep. Elora looked at Jude and Shamir, then sat between them on a bench under the sunny window. She'd planned to come up with some grand story, an explanation of how they'd been studying at the Enclave but had to travel into the mountains to help a family member, then got stuck and missed their consecration. Possible lies had run through her head as they'd hiked through the trees for the second time this morning. But her stomach had been grumbling, and her feet ached. Now, sitting in this room with Tara finally able to rest, her mind went blank, picked clean, like rows of fresh sprouts in their garden after a rabbit wriggled under the fence. Elora blinked and took in the vaulted ceiling, wooden beams, and the back wall made of the cliff itself, then glanced back at the steward rocking in his chair. He stared directly at her, and his gaze seemed to reach her soul. She'd felt herself begin to crumble in the other room, but now her walls fell in earnest. Even reaching out to Jude couldn't stop the collapse. Her eyes filled with tears, and her body began to shake. Then she opened her mouth and blurted out the truth. Jude held her as she started from the beginning, from the day she and Jude walked back from the lake, how her father had hurt Tara, how she'd decided to run. Jude jumped in and told the steward about his discoveries in his mother's closet, how he'd found out about his family and his possible link to the magic. When Elora's voice faltered, Shamir explained how they'd met with the balancer. She pulled the elixir from her pocket and set it on the side table. Ryman's smile slowly faded as Elora relayed the night before, what had happened when they'd taken a drop and been soothed by it, and how Tam had told them they'd never be accepted in the Enclave. Elora purged herself of every parasitic piece of their story that clawed at her insides, twisting and gnawing at her until she could barely breathe. When she finished, she drew a breath and stared at the steward. When had his chair stopped rocking? The room was silent. Nothing had been decided. They had no answers, and Ryman still sat with a drawn expression. Yet Elora finally felt at peace. The steward crossed one leg over his knee. Your sister won't make it more than a week if you don't get her to the Enclave. Elora blinked. She didn't know what she'd expected him to say, but that wasn't it. Had he not heard anything she said? How could he know anything about Tara's state? He'd barely seen her when they walked inside. How do you know? Her aura. It's tinged at the edges, he stated. Your sight shows you that? Shamir asked, her voice little more than a whisper. The steward gave a slight nod. Mine does. Tears filled Elora's eyes for the second time. Everything she knew of a blessing giver's sight was from books. None of them had mentioned an ability like this. You know we can't go to the Enclave, You can, if you're consecrated. Elora's stomach flipped, and she squeezed Jude's hand. Consecrated. He'd been the one to bring it up. Did that mean the steward was considering it? What would that mean for us? Jude asked. Ryman exhaled. They wouldn't be happy about it, but they'd have to let you in. The order requires ministration to those consecrated to the magic. Jude swallowed. They'd accept us. He scoffed. I didn't say that. You'd hardly be one of them. However, they wouldn't cast you out as long as you kept at... Oh, wait. They wouldn't cast you out as long as you kept to the rules. Elora's pulse raced. But they could help Tara. We'd have a place to live? You'd have to lie. Tell them you received your sight in Calwain. Don't ever mention this place or me. Why Calwain? Elora asked. Ryman scoffed. Things like this happen there. Odd things. Miraculous things we can't make sense of. It will be easier for them to believe if you package it with what they know. And they can help my sister? Elora repeated her question. The steward wet his lips and leaned forward. If there's anything to be done, only blessing givers with herbalist training can help her. Shamir straightened, but Elora didn't notice. He'd said if, and if wasn't an option. You left the Enclave. Do you still have authority? Was that the word Tam had used? Ryman's mouth curled. As much as the ambassador wished my authority stripped, I still hold it. I still hold it. And you'll consecrate us? Elora's lower lip wobbled. This was it. Their ticket out. They'd be able to travel to Aerith and join the Enclave, get help for Tara, escape Piatha and their father, discover their true callings in the magic. Ryman sighed. I can officiate, though I'm not sure if it will work. I'm a blessing giver. From what you've told me, it doesn't sound like you know your bloodline. Elora swallowed. I don't. Jude pursed his lips. I believe my great-grandfather was a balancer. Ryman nodded. It may not work, but if it does, are you sure this is what you want? Elora turned to her best friend. Shamir had a family in Piatha, parents who loved her. Sina, who was waiting to train her as an herbalist. Shamir, you don't have to. I know. Shamir squared her shoulders. Elora, this is our next step. I can feel it. There's something for us there. But what about your family? Shamir winced. I'll go back before we go to Aerith. I'll go back before we go to Aerith. They know how much I want to be an herbalist, and once they see this... She lifted a hand to her cheek. I hope they'll understand. I hope they'll understand. Tears dropped down Elora's cheeks as she pulled Shamir into an embrace. She laughed out loud when Jude wrapped his arms around both of them and squeezed so tightly they couldn't breathe. When he finally released them, Elora turned back to the steward and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Can I ask you a question? When Ryman nodded, she added, You won't change your mind if I ask it, will you? He chuckled and motioned for her to continue. Elora wrung her hands. Elora wrung her hands. We know this is against the rules for your enclave. Why would you do this for us? People you barely know. Ryman's lip twitched. He stood from the chair and smoothed his slacks. I left the enclave because I believe the Order is heading in the wrong direction. I believe the magic is awakening, as foretold in prophecy. You landing on my doorstep is proof of that. He strode across the room and opened a black book, then licked his index finger and turned the pages. Have you read the prophecy? Shamir shook her head as both Jude and Elora nodded. Ryman winked at Shamir and cleared his throat. I'll read it again for good measure. This is from the Book of Ariadne, recorded by Josephine the prophetess. My magic is given freely, but protected with a purpose. And I give unto you a warning, that upon the day my fount is polluted, ye shall know the great and formidable day of Sidoni is near. He paused and drew a breath. But I shall not leave my people unprepared. My power, sealed to their blood, will awaken. Many have I called to gather those that are lost, and they will rise in new power as the bonds of Sidoni weaken. Only when my power is whole will it become a protector. Only when the magic is complete will it fail. The steward glanced up. This is not the first time someone has shown up on my doorstep, claiming they were called by the magic. Until members of the order open their eyes to these awakenings, he closed the book and set it back on the shelf. I'll continue to gather. Elora dipped her hands into the wash basin in the cellar, then rubbed the bar of lavender soap between her palms. Ryman had suggested they all rest for an hour before beginning the ceremony, and they'd gladly taken him up on it. Waking Tara had been like stirring the dead. Elora breathed a sigh of relief when her eyes eventually flickered open, and they succeeded in propping her up on the bench in the other room. Shamir had quickly washed, then offered to sit beside her while Elora cleaned up. Now it was only her and Jude at the wash basin. Elora cupped her hands and scooped the cool water up, then splashed it over her face. Every movement was muscle memory because her mind was anywhere but in her body. Prophecy and scripture melded with questions about Ryman's history with the Order. Did the magic really bring them here? Were they part of prophecy as he suggested? Was every step of their journey guided by the goddess herself? That would mean her father, with his violence and fury, had helped them? She couldn't accept that. He was darkness, and the goddess was light. How could one lead to the other? I think it's clean. Jude put a hand on her shoulder, and Elora froze. Your face? You've washed it 4 times. Elora straightened and reached for the towel. I'm sorry. Jude grinned. Don't be. Elora moved to the side to make room for him at the wash basin while she dried her skin. 4 times? Her cheeks flushed. I wonder what blessing givers normally do on their consecration day. Jude lifted his head, and water dripped from his nose and chin. She handed him a towel. He dried the water from his face. When he met her gaze, his skin was vibrant and pink. You don't think they rinse in a stranger's cellar and call it good? Elora laughed, then put a hand over her mouth. It felt wrong to find humor in a situation like this. Jude circled his fingers around her wrist. It's okay to be happy, Elora. This is something to celebrate. She allowed him to lower her hand. Was it okay? Elora sighed. I don't know how to do both things. Celebration? How could she feel that when she was overcome with grief at losing her home and walking away from everything she'd ever known, even if it wasn't worth missing? That weighed her down heavier than the pack she'd carried on her back. Fear dug its claws into her heart every time she glanced at Tara, and an emptiness settled in her belly the moment they'd gotten in the coach. Jude set the towel on the counter and stepped forward until their toes touched. Everyone awaited them in the other room, but now all she could think about was his foot against hers. Elora, I don't know what tomorrow or even next week will bring, but I'll teach you something I learned hauling wood. Jude slipped a hand around her waist and pulled her to him until their bodies were flush. I told myself I didn't need to worry about how much more we had to do, or how I'd get up and do it again the following day. All I had to do was be in that moment, bring myself back to then and there, get through the next load. Take the next step. Elora's breathing quickened. If I don't think about tomorrow, we might not... Jude put a finger to her lips. We might not. It's true. He turned his hand and cupped her face. But we might. I don't want you to miss what's happening right now, because you're stuck figuring out which one it is. Elora closed her eyes and leaned into his palm. breathing in the faint scent of lavender still clinging to his skin. I don't know how. Jude lowered his head and took her mouth in his. Elora gasped and stole his breath as his fingers pressed into her lower back. She was as rigid as new leather, while Jude felt worn in. She was as rigid as new leather, while Jude felt worn in. How? How could he face the same unknowns she did and still seem so at ease? She clung to him, willing herself to absorb strands of whatever energy he had. He'd already surrendered to the current, and here she was paddling upstream. His kiss helped. Her worries were still there, but she couldn't clutch them as tightly when his breath mixed with hers. Instead, a soft, glowing hum filled her head as her skin smoldered everywhere he touched. A tug against her hip, pressure against the back of her neck, a whisper against her cheek. Jude's touch was magic. He made it easier for her to forget, to trust. Jude pulled her hips to his, and something inside of Elora broke loose, like a stream beginning to flow again after winter's freeze. Elora sighed as she liquefied against him, pressing her lips more fervently against his as she worked to memorize the curve of his mouth. A hunger awakened inside her, clamoring for her to recognize how much she needed this, how much she needed him. On her own, she got tangled up in everything that could be, instead of seeing what was. Every moment she'd spent with Jude seemed to slow time, to soothe, to calm. He peeled her fingers from the reins and forced her to look up from the wheels. She rocked her hips against his, winding her fingers in his shirt. Jude's hands began to tremble, but then his mouth curled as he pulled back. "No," she whimpered. She didn't want this to stop. Jude chuckled, his voice low and smooth. She opened her eyes and blinked. "There it is. I knew you could let go," he teased. Elora swallowed and worked to catch her breath. "I'm going to need you to do that again." He brushed her hair behind... "I'm going to need you to do that again." He brushed her hair behind her ear. "You mean you like when I help?" Her lips tingled as she nodded. "Yes, very much." Jude grinned. His hair was mussed and his skin flushed. "As much as I agree, I think we have people waiting for us. For some ceremony or something." Elora groaned. "Right. Only the most important ceremony of their lives to date." She dropped her hands from his waist. Jude brushed his lips against hers one last time. "We'll have plenty of time for more of this later," he murmured. "And I can't wait to see your eyes." He stepped back. As his hand left her hip, she snatched it into hers. "Jude?" He paused and turned his head. She wanted to thank him, to express how much it meant to her that he'd helped them get this far. Tell him she forgave him for lying to her about the magic, how grateful she was for him simply being here. She wanted to say it all, but her thoughts jumbled together, and nothing came out. He squeezed her hand. "I know." They walked back into the living room where the others waited patiently. Elora didn't let go of his hand, and she ignored Shamir's raised eyebrow as they sat on the bench. Ryman smiled at the four of them. "You're clean. That must mean it's time." He stood and walked toward Tara first. "What's your full name?" "Tara Wayland." Her voice was breathy, and Elora's heart twinged. "Very well." Ryman lifted his hands, holding them out on both sides of her temples, and began to speak. Whew, that was chapter 10. And I think, let me see. I think chapter 11 is our last chapter, but I don't think I'm going to have time